I'm Michael, and welcome to Beyond the Screenplay, the podcast where each week we do a conversational deep dive analysis into a film. Today we're talking about The Lighthouse, the 2019 film directed by Robert Eggers, written by Robert Eggers and Max Eggers. I'm joined today by part of the Beyond the Screenplay team, Trisha Arand.
Hello, everybody.
And Brian Bittner.
Ahoy, hoy.
And our guest today is a fellow YouTube video essayist. Her website and Twitter bio describes her as an actor, writer, and court jester, Maggie Mayfish. Thank you for joining us today.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me. What a wonderful film to sit down and chat about today.
Yes, very excited about it. Before we dive in, quick shout out for everyone listening on Spotify. Our Q&A question for you today is, what is your favorite black and white film? I really want to know. I love black and white films. There should be more of them. And I want to know what all of your favorite ones are. So let us know.
And it can be old timey, like it had to be black and white, or it can be new, where it didn't have to be black and white, where it's more of a choice.
Indeed.
It could be Casablanca, and that's a great answer too.
And that's okay.
Yes.
Awesome. So we're here to talk about The Lighthouse. There's a ton of things to talk about. The cinematography, already we started talking about black and white, the atmosphere, the performances, so many things. But before we dive in, first, so our listeners can kind of get to know you a little bit better, Maggie. So you've been making videos since 2018 on YouTube?
Yes.
If I'm correct?
Yes.
So what drew you to start making film analysis videos on YouTube?
Yeah. So I worked at Cracked the year right before it went under with many dear online comedy websites that I hold dear in my heart. But yeah, so while I was working at Cracked, I wrote on a couple different shows, but a lot of the shows that I pitch had to do with movies. That's my undergrad education was in theater and film analysis and creative writing. So yeah, so a lot of things I was pitching, is actually very similar to the things that I still do today on YouTube. So yeah, it kind of transformed from my show at Cracked into, me just doing it on my own. And yeah, my background is more actor performance. So I love looking at movies from that angle, just because, that's the world that I live in. So yeah, I think it offers like a fun perspective. And also, like, being an actor, you are very powerless when it comes to basically everything. So yeah, so analyzing films is a way, to speak to something on an emotional level, because usually when you get to the actors, they have to take all the themes and the emotions that you put into your film and bring it to life. So yeah, a lot of my criticisms and analysis come from like, oh man, like what would that look like when it, gets down to that level? So yeah.
Yeah, I love your videos. I've mentioned on the podcast before, your Zack Snyder series was extremely cathartic for me. Highly recommend. And yeah, it's film analysis. It's very smart, but it's also fun and entertaining. And your comedy background, I think, informs that. That makes a lot of sense. And so when we asked you to come on the podcast, we asked you to suggest some movies for us to check out. And you suggested The Lighthouse, which is great because I hadn't seen it before. Trisha, this was your first time watching it. So yeah, what do you love about The Lighthouse? And maybe tell us, like, even the first time you saw it, what was your experience watching it the first time?
Oh man, the first time I watched it, I was so just enthralled that it was such a small location that, everything was, and very pointedly, claustrophobic. The performances were just amazing. I loved being immersed with the two, being trapped in the lighthouse with them. I thought it was so simple in a way, but also very, very much, it's a very competently well-made film, which is hard to do. So I don't want to say it's simple in that regard, but simple in the way that it was so, like, it just made a meal out of everything, which I loved. And just getting to watch, William Dafoe and Robert Pattinson work together is a fascinating and fun. And it just seemed like a project that everyone had, a blast making. And yeah, I loved the end result. So,
yeah. It's all those things. It makes you feel claustrophobic. It's a whole ride. I was pretty nervous going into it because I'd kind of been warned that it might not be like potentially up my alley.
Oh, interesting.
But I ended up really loving it. And Brian, you had seen it in theaters, right?
No.
No, okay. I missed, but you had seen it
No.
before.
I did. Yeah, I saw it when
Okay.
I was just catching up on all the 2019 movies in like early 2020.
Okay.
And I knew it was probably one that I was like, is my girlfriend going to want to watch this? I don't know if she'll care or not. So I was like, I'm just going to watch it by myself. And I woke up one morning at 6 a.m. and I knew she'd be in bed for like hours. And I was like, I'm going to watch The Lighthouse right now. So I watched The Lighthouse for the first time at 6 a.m, which was actually so perfect because I was just so fresh and like able to focus on it. And yeah, I liked it a lot. I'm like such a sucker for weird, puzzly art house kind of movies. And I'm really happy we have this new generation of these directors who most of them are working with A24. But you've got Robert Eggers, you've got Yorgos Lanthimos, who did The Lobster and The Favorite, Jennifer Kent, who did The Babadook, Trey Edward Schultz, It Comes at Night, Waves, Ari Aster, of course, Hereditary, Midsummer. And I haven't loved all those movies. A lot of them feel too drawn out, some are too pretentious, some just leave me like wanting more at the end. But I'm very glad they exist, and I'm very glad someone is giving them money to just make like whatever crazy crap is in their head. Lots more to say, but I'll stop there for now.
Awesome. Yeah. And Trisha, what about you? What were your first impressions?
Yeah, so I wanted to see this movie when it came out because those that know me will know I'm a history fan, but also I'm like a weird maritime naval history junkie.
Whoa, that's awesome.
So my father was a sailor. He was in the Coast Guard for 20 years.
Wow.
And like a lot of dads, whether or not they are sailors, he is also a fan of maritime history. And so I've read a lot of those like big old maritime epic book series. I'm a huge fan of Horatio Hornblower. And if anyone is familiar with that, and like the Master and Commander, Aubrey Maturin movies. And so this really fascinated me because I was like, we're letting somebody make like a very salty, like 1890 maritime thing. Cool. I like that. And then I'm also fascinated by Lighthouse history, which we can also get into because I was mainly grew up on the East Coast, and there's like a big weird culture about lighthouses there and in the Great Lakes.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna say, Maggie, you're from Michigan.
Michigan,
so
yeah.
You know all about the lighthouses.
Oh, so many.
Yeah. Anyway, I wanted to see it, and I didn't get to it at the time, and I really liked it. I'm really, really glad that thank you so much for bringing it to the table for us, Maggie.
Yes.
I have lots of thoughts.
My other thought that it's a perfect like quarantine movie. Like something about it just like speaks to particularly now, which is, yeah.
Right. Stuck in a place, kind of slowly going mad. Time is passing, question mark?
Maybe. Yeah.
Right.
How long's it been since Monday? I don't know. Days, weeks, who knows?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
One of the things that after watching it, I kind of went down a rabbit hole and watched some interviews with Robert Eggers and him talking about his process. And he talked about the difference between atmospheric films and more story-based films. And so he said, I'm going to kind of read a quote here where he's talking about if you have a normal story-based film, basically all you need is an excellent script with a great story, serviceable performances. They don't have to be good. They just have to be serviceable. You don't need good cinematography. You don't need good art direction. You don't need good costumes. You don't need good sound design. You have to have professional sound so it's not distracting, but it's really about the script. And so that was an interesting portrait of like on one end of the spectrum, a film where the story is doing all the heavy lifting. The Lighthouse is very much not on that side of the spectrum, where it's the atmosphere that's doing so much of the lifting. And he talked about atmosphere as being like an accumulation of details and almost like a visual obstacle. And so I found that really interesting and fascinating and curious, like, Maggie, how would you even describe the atmosphere, and what are the things that like pull you into this world? Because it's so rich, despite, as you're saying, being very focused and small.
Yeah, that's a great description of it because it has like everything about film that like the costumes are fantastic, even the performances. The dialect is obviously like of note, but the physical performances are also like that all adds to it. So yeah, it's almost like everything is tip top besides the script to make it such like an interesting movie. But yeah, so as far as the atmosphere, a lot of the physicality of the actors draws me in. Like you can just see it on Robert Pattinson's face, all the times that like William Dafoe's like needling him with these like tiny comments and back and forth. You can see when things like land on each other, but it's so subtle and it adds to that like atmospheric of like some something's going on like above and beneath the surface of what we're seeing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and the like fairy tale elements of it add to the atmosphere as well, because it kind of pulls you out of the lighthouse, but then like throws you back in because he always like wakes up back in his bed. So yeah, things like that kind of make it kind of like a that long poem, the Albatross, very much that. A long winding like poem in a way. Yeah, but yeah, the feeling it gives is very like evocative and like grossly sexual. Like things are very sexual, but it's also like it's like it's tying it's like tying together this idea of if things are physically disgusting, like the place is disgusting, so it's like that mixed feeling of like sexualness, but like everything is like covered in it's like a mixture of feelings that all come together to give you a feeling that isn't necessarily there like in the actual writing of the script.
I think another thing that this movie does really well is to use this aspect ratio that's it's not quite 4:3, it's 1.19 to 1, but just sort of a squarish aspect ratio, which I was against when movies started doing that in the past couple of years. I was like, look, we have wide screens now, knock it off, like stuff. But then I saw First Reformed, which Trisha, I know you love. And I feel like that's not a horror movie, but I feel like it did a better job of making me feel uneasy than most horror movies. And part of that is this like very narrow image, and Ethan Hawke will like just sort of like leave the image and come back sometimes. I'm like, where'd he go? He's gone. And The Lighthouse did a very similar thing during a 31 horror movies in October horror marathon that my girlfriend and I did. We watched in one day Friday the 13th, Halloween, and Nightmare on Elm Street, the first of each. And then it was like 8 p.m. We're like, let's do one more. And I was looking through the list and I was like, ooh, let's watch The Witch. And I put on the trailer and she's like, oh man, let's watch this right now. The trailer's got like black goat, da-da-da. The Witch by Robert Eggers, for anyone who doesn't know. Then we watched it and it's a very slow kind of drama. And there's like basically no witch. There's no, like nothing happens.
Yep.
And, if you go in expecting the kind of movie that it is, I think you can enjoy it. But like it sort of, I think, promises something that's not quite there. The Lighthouse, I think, promises the movie that you're going to get right in the first, few minutes. And I feel like it's a better horror movie by the guy who made The Witch, but it's called The Lighthouse, and it's a better horror movie than The Witch. So yeah, I love the feeling of just being uneasy, and like you said, the claustrophobic feeling, the grossness, the sort of just like I am in this world 100%, and in a way that makes me uncomfortable. And that's cool.
Yeah, what you were saying about the square frame where it feels like it's hiding aspects of like something is happening over there, and which taps into sort of a primal like we're afraid of the dark because we don't know what's in it. The aspect ratio taps into we're afraid of anything we can't see, right? And so having that space on the sides of the screens where we kind of intuitively sense that there's more going on that we can't see, that the characters are potentially experiencing, which is a tribute to how immersive the world feels. Another big part of, I think, what creates that feeling is the lighting in this movie. So we talked about Mank in December and how Fincher was determined to do some old-timey things and then just totally didn't do other old-timey things he very easily could have done. He made some choices. This is like seems so committed to being really immersive. And the lighting is a huge part of that to me, where you can see like candles and lanterns, and it feels like, I guess I was reading that even when they were shooting outside, there wasn't really enough light. So they were like using muslin to bounce light off of and things to get enough light. And of course, it's shot on 35. I feel like that is another thing where psychologically the frame wouldn't affect us the way that it does if the rest of the elements weren't as immersive as they are. But because all of those things are there, it does give you that. It's like watching a ghost story, right? It's like watching a very like a piece of lore, which of course it's supposed to feel like, Samuel Taylor Coleridge kind of, maritime poem kind of thing, like you were saying.
Yeah, lighting was very Barry Lyndon, like very much like it almost like sucked you into the frame even further, which is already cropped off because there's only small parts of light that you can see, especially, in the night scenes, the night scenes.
Well, and a shot that comes to mind is the first time Robert Pattinson's character goes into their like living quarters. There's, like a big pillar in the middle of the room, and the shot composition is such that that pillar is like just a big black bar in the middle, and that's obscuring Willem Dafoe. So you're already creating two mini frames inside of this already square aspect ratio, and you really get that claustrophobia, but also, as you're saying, this fear of the unknown, because there's something there that we can't see. I'm someone that can get annoyed by stylistic choices just for stylistic sake. Definitely. And I feel like The Lighthouse is a great example of all of the style is really doing work and working together to create the atmosphere and put you into the head of these characters. And even, the debate between like film versus digital, I tend to be like, well, digital unless you don't have to. But so I read an interview with Robert Eggers, who was then quoting an interview with Emmanuel Lubezki, also known as Chivo, who was a cinematographer for lots of things, The Revenant, Children of Men, I believe. So this quote from him, the Chivo, is talking about how in The Revenant, he decided to go with digital for the first time because they were doing all this like exterior natural light stuff, and film just didn't have a high enough ISO to pick up all the light. And he described it as, for the first time with digital, it felt like I was looking through a clean window, that like through all the film history, we've been looking through dirty windows, and now there's a clean window. And I thought that was a really cool way to describe digital. And then Robert Eggers was like, yeah, but I like dirty windows.
Right.
None of that for me, please.
No, thank you. Yeah, I will agree. Though one of the reasons I love this movie is because all the stylistic choices have a purpose and contribute to the story where, so often you see something that's like gimmicky, or even like half of the movie's gimmicky and the other half like doesn't go, so things, and it just ends up feeling like, well, great, you just picked it because it looks cool. But for this, all the interesting choices really do serve the story. Yeah, which is refreshing.
Yeah, always nice to see.
Always nice.
Well, and you mentioned also the way it manipulates time. Yeah, I wonder if you could like talk about that too, because that was definitely something that there's a moment that happens early on where Robert Pattinson's character for the first time seems confused about how much time was passing. And even like leading up to that, I was watching it with my girlfriend and we were like, wait, it's already been 3 weeks? Wait, it's already been 4 weeks. How much time has passed? Yeah.
Yeah, I think like 3/4 of the way through the movie, there's that scene where it's like, how long have we been here? 10 days, 10 hours. And it's like, that's so funny. But also, like leading up to that, the film does like very much, trick you, especially with the way like things are moving. Again, with Robert Pattinson, like not waking up where he fell asleep, like scenes repeating where you're like, wait, we did see, we saw this before, or he's done this chore before, or even scenes where we saw Robert Pattinson do the chore, but then William Dafoe is like, you didn't do it. And it's like, whoa, okay, so and, we don't need to know what the truth is because that's not, necessary to the story. It is supposed to be confusing. And there's a lot of like circular shooting. The pillar itself, when he goes around the stairs, it's circular. And then right after that shot, Robert Pattinson's outside, but the camera is still moving in circles, watching him like walk around. The way the camera moves, it's very like cyclical and continuous.
Which this movie obviously plays a lot with Greek mythology and stuff, and I think that you get the very clear Sisyphus kind of reference as he's pulling the oil drum up the stairs, stair by stair by stair, and then finally he gets to the top and he's like, you don't need to do that, take it back down, and he has to take it all the way back down. And then of course just the Prometheus at the end, is like the most pointed, like, look, we did a thing. Look at this thing we built up towards. But it's paid off by all the symbols in this movie too, which I also love. The seagulls and the mermaid and the light. It's like he gets too close to the light, and then the seagulls, which he killed one, bad luck. This ship's now, there's a storm, the wind's changed, like all that kind of stuff. Like, I just like that it's very clearly sort of like doing a thing and showing you like we are referencing things that you may or may not have heard of. If you have heard of it, great, you're going to get it. But if you haven't heard of it, hopefully you'll look it up later, or hopefully you'll appreciate it in and of itself. But also you look it up later, you're like, oh, you referenced that painting, you referenced that story, and I just think it's fun when art does that. We
were talking in the Coraline episode about fairy tales, ghost stories, and grotesques. And we were talking about the odd specificity of lore and how, like, even though we take fairy tales and things like that and we widely adapt and apply them. Like anything can be a Cinderella story, but yet there are really specific things about it that make it like a Cinderella story, where it's like the fairy godmother and the pumpkins and the stepsisters and the ball and the three knights repeating. And there are these very specific elements. And I feel like this movie does a really good job of creating those kinds of symbols and that kind of specificity that give it the lore. And some of it is borrowed from lore that we're familiar with already. Like we talked about, there's an element of like known superstition of, you don't kill a seabird and things like that. It's bad luck. It's referencing things that we are familiar with that are already aspects of like sort of American folk tales, but it's also creating its own. The fact that they're both named Thomas, which I guess is inspired by something real that happened. But it's the same way that we're fascinated by odd details like that, where two lighthouse keepers named Thomas, that was a real thing that happened at Small's Lighthouse, and one of them died. And that was kind of like people embellished that story and everything. There's another real story that this is referencing, the Flannan Isles Lighthouse incident, where 3 lighthouse keepers completely disappeared in 1900, which is right around the time that this movie is set. And that fascinated people so much that they started adding these weirdly specific details where they were like, there was a meal laid out, but no one had eaten the meal. There were these like logs that were referencing this storm coming in, but then there was no evidence of the storm or evidence of them being swept away. Again, we are creating like sort of specific things the way that this movie does around all of these other symbols that it's incorporating. So I think that's another big part of, again, just putting you in the headspace of, it's historical, it feels really grounded, but it's also not meant to be read literally in any way. It's mythological, it's folklore, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, like you get into the first mermaid vision probably 15 minutes into the movie or something. Like pretty quickly the movie's like, this is this kind of movie. This isn't like our gritty realism,
right
1900 Lighthouse movie. Yeah.
In that same talk, Robert Eggers talked about how he likes archetypal storytelling.
Yeah.
So I've been watching on Netflix David Letterman's series on My Next Guest Needs No Introduction, where he interviews different people. And I was recently watching the one where he interviews Jay-Z, and Jay-Z is talking about how like his goal, you can create kind of pop tracks that come and go, but the tracks he loves are the ones that are kind of forever tracks. And so he's kind of constantly chasing, creating a song that'll last forever and be relevant for forever. And this kind of archetypal storytelling that's happening and having this film be set in the past and all these things make it feel like it won't age. Like it feels like it's from a different time while also being really modern and speaking to us today. And I think that's a rare thing to find a film that can do both of those things at once. And I think it's just really impressive.
Yeah, it's something I find with music. It's like you have the Gnarls Barkley album from 2005 or whatever that's like you're obsessed with for about a month. And you're like, I never want to hear this again ever. And then a lot of my favorite music, it's like it takes me 5 or 6 listens for. I'm like, oh, okay, here we go. And then I never get sick of it, and I think you get the same thing. We just talked about Birdman, like movies where first time through, maybe you're not like blown away, but then each time you're like, I like this more. And I like movies that sort of, I don't need to love it the first time because I'm willing to go back in and sort of keep giving it more time, and I think that's what you get with a lot of these sort of artsy kind of heady movies is like they reward rewatching.
Definitely.
Yeah, this movie definitely has that like sense of ambiguity that it's like, especially with the ending. I read a brief interview with the director, and he mentioned Lost Highway as being an inspiration for this movie again. Yeah, how it's very like, it's so easy to like revisit and go back and watch it again because it's like, it's not like a story that wraps up with a nice little bow. It's like, I guess I know how Paddington 2 ends, but... So yeah, upon rewatch, you can, get different things out of it. And yeah, that like ambiguous nature of it is, fun to go back and relook at.
Yeah. And I think it's the blend of there's enough story that you're hooked, but the atmosphere is so rich and it's dripping that it's like, it's a world that I want. Not that I want to be in.
Yeah, you don't want to be in the lighthouse with them. Ugh.
Right. But like the experience of watching the film, it feels like a place in my head and not just like a movie.
Right.
And it's like I want to go back and revisit that place, which is pretty cool. You talked earlier, Maggie, about the performances. And I'm curious because you have a performance background. How do you judge a performance? Like for you, what makes a performance good?
That's interesting.
Because it can be subjective. I know different people have different things, but yeah, I'm curious for you.
That's true. For the most part, judging is a harsh word, but for the most part, I will basically be enamored with almost any performance. Like Vanessa Hudgens in The Princess Switched Again is an amazing performance. Like regardless of the film, you can tell that she herself as an actor is, fully immersing herself in the story, just things like that you can kind of pick up on. And really, you can kind of just almost tell if the actor wants to be there, I guess, which seems like a very unscientific way to think about it, but truly a performance that feels like it's really pulling you in and drawing you in. It's because the actor is drawn in and pulled in. And yeah, with William Dafoe and Robert Pattinson, when they're in each other's faces going no, you,
with E.
with me, yes. They are the only two people in the room, and which is obviously not they're surrounded by sound people, the director, that's not the reality, but when you're watching it, that is the reality. And so to me, that is a great performance. Yeah, when you just can't, almost parts of the movie fall deeper into place because you're not distracted by, something that feels out of place in a character's performance. I guess for me personally, and I mentioned this earlier, but physicality is important, especially to me as an actor with my comedy background. When you see actors how they physically move in this space, that adds so much that I think a lot of people, watching it probably wouldn't even think about. But yeah, just you can see the stress on both of their bodies and and the way that they lie in bed and crouch over and move, that adds so much. There's so much storytelling, even when there's no words being said. So I think really that's what takes both of their performances to the next level.
Yeah. I don't understand how Willem Dafoe was not nominated for this performance, let alone won 2 years in a row. They should have just the next year been you get another one for the Lighthouse. It blows my mind he wasn't nominated.
Yeah, I do feel because it's William Dafoe, I think a lot of people will watch this and be well, it's William Dafoe doing well, it almost seems like it would be easy for him and can't see the the hard work that goes into making that dialect part of your body, your mouth physically needs to learn how to move in that way, in such a way that it feels like you've been talking that way forever, which he's a very talented actor. So, I'm sure, it's definitely within his wheelhouse, but there's so much work that goes into that. And yeah, the physicality and all the scenes really play out like a play.
Very much.
Yeah, there's no cuts. It's very much, like a play, which is a very different prep work than when you're filming something. Because usually when you're filming, you can look at the script and there's different things you can do, but they both have theater backgrounds and they both, are very serious actors who take their craft very seriously. And yeah, you can see that in the scenes when they work together. It does have a play-like quality, they've been, rehearsing for months. Yeah.
I love the language, which is written here incredibly, but as you're pointing out, it's delivered just unbelievably. Robert Pattinson's accent is what's called a Downeaster accent, which is from upper New England, coast of Maine. The Downeaster accent, if you're familiar with it, is not today now what it was in 1890, but it's such a hard and weird accent that I feel when you read actors' resumes and they're I could do a Scottish accent or I can do an Australian accent. No one's I've got a Downeaster accent in here, and especially not one from that specific time period. And it's different than Willem Dafoe's accent in this. Their ways of communicating are completely different. The syntax and rhythm of their speech, the cadence of their speech are completely different, that are placing them in different worlds. And I would almost say even social classes, even though they're both working men essentially. And it does create that sense of some rootedness, which I think you need to relate to the characters at all, but also a sense of mystery where they have stories upon stories upon stories that we have not heard or couldn't possibly guess at. So when Willem Dafoe is talking about, his character is discussing being at sea and having scurvy and everyone's teeth are falling and toes are falling off or whatever it is. you're like, yeah, probably. Like, it's the language as it's written, but it's also in the performance and the delivery of like, either he really saw all of this and it happened, or he's told this story 100 times.
Mhm.
And it's so natural to him that he's really good at telling it. That feeling of the characters being lived in, echoes back that feeling of lore, where there's like, they're telling stories about their past and maybe they're true, maybe they're not, but there's truth in them. And that's like projected at every word that these characters speak. It's cool. It's so cool.
It's so cool.
Maggie, you mentioned this feeling of you can feel when the actor wants to be there. I immediately flashed back to, we did a podcast about the Star Wars prequels, and in Revenge of the Sith, I feel like you can feel that Natalie Portman really does not want to be there.
Yeah. Oh, poor
God bless.
Natalie. She's been through so much.
Yeah. That's a great stark juxtaposition. Kind of like you're saying there then, Trisha, too. It's almost like the same way atmosphere is this kind of accumulation of details, and kind of what you were saying, Maggie, too, that there's all these little things in the performance. It's not just, the line reading that's happening, but all these little things that make them feel like they are in this place and bring you into that place. And there's even, I found it more impressive because for me, there were some hurdles, like, Robert Pattinson is Robert Pattinson. So sometimes it can be hard to.
Yeah, that's a hurdle. He'd be himself. Yeah, absolutely.
Right. But he totally did it for me. And Willem Dafoe, at the very beginning, I was getting a little bit of like, I'm watching The Life Aquatic here because it's Willem Dafoe. But it's totally different by the end. So the performances are really, really great. And hearing about Willem Dafoe talked a little bit about his process and his relation to backstory and how he feels like, you can't play backstory. You can only kind of play what's happening in the room, your actions, but you can draw upon that to inform how you pursue your actions and stuff like that.
I feel like I want to have a couple of drinks with Willem Dafoe, to be honest.
Wouldn't that be a wonderful?
That would be so much fun.
He also sought out Robert Eggers, and I just feel like he's constantly like looking like for like the Lars von Triers. He's just like, who's the next like messed up, right?
Who is the weirdest guy I can work with?
Yeah. Who's gonna give me something like that? I mean, these are the roles that he's like.
Yeah, he's like, I got a face for weird movies. Let's do this.
Let's do this.
But it's also not just completely over the top. Like it's not, because I feel like that's another version of, acting that can maybe pull you out of it, is when people are spending too much time, like, luxuriating in the over the top, and I'm going to get to make crazy faces. So getting to play these scenes that are big and there are these dramatic turns and he has some crazy monologues. So to do it, but also make it feel like real and believable, is just the finesse required to do that is very impressive.
Yeah. And to be able to take all the lines and make them like active, which is another, like, when actors will just say their line and it feels like something's missing, it's usually because actually when we're talking, we're doing something, with our words or whatever. Yeah. And both actors are so great and so present with each other that, so when they're talking, it feels more like a ping pong match than, two actors just yelling at each other in a lighthouse. Yeah.
Saying lines. Yeah.
Right.
In we made the distinction at the beginning about like a story movie versus an atmosphere movie. And in a story movie, we're always talking about, well, what's the motivation in this scene? What's the goal in this scene? And this movie does like almost a really purposeful job of stripping goals out of scenes.
Yeah.
There is no motivation. The motivation is to pass the time, essentially. Yeah, exactly. Like it's shifting so quickly minute to minute that it doesn't matter. And I feel like that's really hard, or would be hard for an actor to play if you don't know, sort of what you're aiming for. You don't have a goal in a scene. Then you're like, well, then why am I saying this monologue? What does any of this mean?
Right. Yeah.
And being able to keep those kinds of scenes as riveting as these are is such a tribute to the writing, but definitely to the performances. And as you're saying, their interaction with each other, it feels like the scene is going somewhere, even though it's not. Or like we have no idea where it's going.
Yeah.
There's still a sense of momentum to the relationship.
It's almost like the same scene over and over again, but the thing that is changing is like that the power dynamics between them, and we are kind of able to track subconsciously, maybe even the slight shift or like where they were before and now where they are now. They're getting super drunk and they're going to fight each other. Now they're going to sleep on each other's and cuddle and like all these things. But like amidst all that, there is all this power shift happening, and we're getting closer to complete insanity, which is really fun. And so, yeah, kind of to that note, I'm curious, because this is a film where there are lots of symbols and things in here, and maybe it's not easily dissected, or there isn't maybe a clear, you should take this away from
There's
this
not
movie.
one reading.
Right. Yeah, I'm curious, Maggie, what are some of the things that you find interesting that you see in this film that you enjoy thinking about?
Oh man, was this a setup so I can talk about how gay it is? Okay. Yeah, I definitely adhere to Edgar's assertion that he has many themes going on, and yeah, none of his movies are, specifically just about one thing. However, this movie has so much symbolism about their relationship, which is a power dynamic shift, which also entails some sexual elements, which is also a kind of power struggle. So I think that is super interesting and adds a lot to, the surface story of, two guys in a lighthouse. But yeah, I wrote down a couple things. Every time they cut away to a mystical creature being sexual in the ocean, it's like, all right, if we know that there's no mermaid, then who was that? The characters like lying to themselves, lying to each other, just a lot of intimate scenes that, will cut away abruptly. And it's like, wait a minute, what happened right after they got done talking? The seagulls who are, effervescent, like peering in on them through the windows, which is very very evasive. Yeah, there's one particular sequence when they're cutting between Robert Pattinson having hanky-panky with a mermaid and that harpoon shot, which is very very phallic image. The lighthouse itself being a very phallic symbol. Yeah, and there's a lot of like less subtler moments of them, basically just looking in on each other, being completely naked, or doing lightly sexual things that just adds like a layer to these two people who are alone in a lighthouse, and kind of speaks to that that. And I think both of them assert very, that they are straight, and then they both talk about, women or, things like that nature, but then somehow those scenes always turn into them being very like drunk and singing together and like being in each other's faces. So yeah, it's a nice little sprinkling of a layer throughout that I think is really fun and, adds to the atmospheric nature of it all.
Well, it's interesting to me because in maritime lore, especially, you have these single-sex environments on sailing vessels, which have always, that's always been like women are not allowed to sail in old-timey sailing things. There's always these undertones of hierarchy and power dynamic, who's in charge, right? Like, and how to bring sailors, unruly men under, into submission, essentially. And no matter like whether that's in a naval context, whether that's in just like a more commercial sailing context, in history and in lore, it's a very present theme, which is if we are isolated, we are fighting for survival against the elements, against the gods, fate, everything, then someone needs to be in charge, which means someone needs to be dominant and everybody else has to obey, pretty much. Again, within the context specifically historically of masculinity. This is drawing from this long tradition of masculine power struggles in these kinds of like survivalist places. And I think it's so fascinating that like all of the imagery in here about, Poseidon and sea gods and curses and that kind of thing, where there's a sense of helplessness, I guess, or just like fate. Like neither one of them is going to survive if they don't like, basically fall into submission. It's just a really interesting look at that aspect of something very primal, right? Survivalist narratives are about our most primal impulses. There's a reason why survivalist narratives like The Revenant are about like, well, who would you murder Would you eat their corpse, right?
Yeah.
Those kinds of questions are what arise in survivalist narratives because it's about like, who are we deep, deep, deep down? And questions about sexuality are exactly those kinds of questions. And so I think that's another unavoidable thing in this kind of narrative. And it's smart the way that Eggers leans into it and makes sort of the whole thing about that.
Yeah, you get that with alcohol too. Like alcohol is a very similar, like a very simple example of something that's like, I'm not like this. I'm not a person who does this until I'm stranded. And there's okay.
Until I'm drinking turpentine.
Right.
Yeah. Actual turpentine by the end of the movie.
Provisions. And yeah, you get that with sexuality. You get that with the power dynamic, or sort of the power struggle, I should say, that Robert Pattinson is going through. It's funny because there's a quote from Robert Eggers where he said that he was asked, are these characters, like, what are you saying about their sexuality? He said, am I saying these characters are gay? No, I'm not saying they're not either. Forget about complexities of human sexuality or their particular inclinations. I'm more about questions and answers in this movie. The end of that quote, regardless of like the sexuality conversation, that quote sort of stuck with me in terms of like, yeah, this does feel like a movie that's more about questions and answers in a way maybe I'm not super fond of. You are left with this sense of like, so were you trying to say something with all of this? Or were you just like, here's some weird images. What do you think? And, but again, most movies don't ask enough questions in the first place. So I like that this movie does. But I just thought it was a funny quote. Like, I don't really have a lot of answers. Like, okay, because that's kind of how I felt watching it.
Yeah, that's kind of what I took.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, there's enough of a story, I think, that you do feel like you've been told the story by the end, or at least I did.
Yeah.
And it does raise all these questions. And it was really interesting, just its examination of masculinity and basically put this kind of like, stereotypical vision of masculinity in this high pressure situation where a lot of the things that are associated with like hyper masculinity are working against you. And like is kind of, I read it anyways, part of what was like driving them crazy. And it took, all this breaking down of all these mental constructs before they were able to just like hug and like embrace. And like it's kind of sad that it requires 4 weeks of isolation and pressure and insanity to like allow that kind of relationship to form. It's all really interesting. And I feel like this movie does, for me anyway, thread that needle of giving me enough that I feel like I've been told a story and I am satisfied, but also raises all these questions. And as you've said, Maggie, like there's enough ambiguity there that you can extract meaning from it as you like. And also, the questions that it raises, I think challenges certain things. And I appreciate when movies do that, like make me think about it and try to figure out like, what would I be like in this situation? My girlfriend when watching it was like, what if this was like two women? Like, I feel like everything would be like
the best kept lighthouse in the world.
Yeah.
Right. The completely different.
Yeah.
Come on in, mermaid. Yeah.
So how did it go? Well, one of us did murder the other one. Oh.
Everything's neat and clean. It's swept, the light is perfectly tended. Everything's rationed. Yep.
Well, why don't we go around and say what lessons we're going to take away from The Lighthouse? Maggie, we'll let you go last. We'll save our guest for last. Brian, what lessons are you going to take away from The Lighthouse?
So we talked about Birdman recently, and I talked about how I really liked that it had these very visible themes. Some movies sort of bury their themes, and some movies are like, we need to tell you this message. And Birdman was we're going to dangle all these in front of you so you can see that they're there. And that's how I feel about The Lighthouse and Symbols. I just, Trisha wrote our awesome video about Parasite with the symbols that are there, some of which I noticed the first time through, some of which I didn't. But with The Lighthouse, going in for the second time, I was like, I'm going to write down every time there's a seagull. I'm going to write down every time there's a mermaid. I'm going to write down every time they talk about the light.
So you're writing our video about The Lighthouse is what I'm hearing, right?
Sure, yeah. I have a whole track.
Volunteered.
But yeah, there's so many, like the light itself, the light belongs to me. And like the light is salvation. The previous lighthouse keeper, like he thought the light was salvation and all this kind of stuff. And I think that especially in weird movies that aren't just like a simple, drama or whatever, it gives you something to latch on to sort of go, okay, I don't know what the hell's happening here, but I see that thing and I can sort of track the life of that thing throughout this movie. I love movies that are puzzles and heady and that kind of thing, but sometimes they're just too alienating and I just don't care. And I just remove myself from the situation. I'm like, I'm done, whatever. Strong symbols, strong motifs. It's a really good way for the audience to lean in and go, oh, I have to figure this out. We all had that friend in 1999 who saw American Beauty and went, but what do the roses mean? What do they mean? You know? And it's like, that's a good question. What do they mean? What do you think they mean? You know, and suddenly now they're leaning into the symbols. They're leaning into the movie instead of just being like, well, that was a weird movie that I don't care about. It gives you something to sort of like think about and sort of track. What did I see? When did I see it? How did it happen? What was the arc? You know, what was the seagull arc? What was the arc with the light, alcohol, the power dynamics? All of these things, they're just things that you can very easily latch onto in a movie that can be a little disorienting.
It kind of reminds me of our episode on Apocalypse Now when I think, Trisha, you pointed out that the plot is super simple. It's just like, we need to get from here to there. And it's simple enough, but there's enough drama there that you can connect to that and follow it. And then it's all these other things that are added that create the meaning. And I think that's kind of what you're saying really nicely, Brian, is that there's, because these symbols are there, they're adding this meaning and creating an emotional experience in the absence of like complex plot mechanics or something. And yeah, I think it works very well in this movie for sure. Trisha, what about you? What's your lesson?
Yeah. So earlier I was talking about how it feels like the characters don't necessarily have goals in scenes, which I basically stand by. But I do think that the characters themselves, as we meet them at the beginning of the movie, do have some like inherent conflict built into them. And I think that that's smart character design, where if you are going to approach a movie not from a story perspective with like, you know, your very solid like superhero structure to it, if you are going to do that, and I think that there is room in the market for that, as this movie proves, and many others, Brian, you were pointing out that right now is a great time if you like to make unhinged sort of weird art movies. Your time is now. But if you are approaching that, the character design needs to come built with conflict, loaded with conflict. And so giving Robert Pattinson's character a secret is a really good way to do that, where he's actively concealing something. He comes in with like this newfound sobriety, where he's like, I don't want to drink. And that's all Willem Dafoe is interested in getting him to do. There is a power struggle, as we talk about, where Robert Pattinson immediately wants to be like an equal lighthouse tender, where he's taking care of the light. And Willem Dafoe doesn't want to let him do that. Even if the character motivations within the scenes are not necessarily like a point A to point B, I'm trying to get, you know, this character to tell me this thing. They're not as actionable as that, but the characters themselves do not mesh together well. If you are going to do this kind of exploratory writing from a screenwriting point of view, which, you know, my understanding, I don't know a ton about the development process, but my understanding is there was definitely like let's just sort of explore the psychology of these characters and then have it go worse and worse and worse for them, right? Trap them here, take away all of their food, you know, give them some curses and some storms and some, you know, whatever. If you are going to do this kind of exploratory, almost, you know, play-like writing, as you pointed out, Maggie, start with really strong character design and load your characters with hidden motivations, conflict, all of this stuff, and then put them in a scene together and let them play. And, you know, I would be interested to know how much after the casting was locked in, how much of the ideas behind the characters then, you know, bled back into the writing. And as we talked about it, obviously it's there in the performances. So just a good rule of thumb, I think, if you're going to do this kind of script.
Yeah, definitely. Earlier, when you were talking about the sort of theaterness of it, I was having flashbacks to studying theater in college. You know, you have to do the work of like, what is your character's objective with every line? And we said this is a movie where it feels like they don't have objectives, but I guarantee you they knew what their objective was. I did a David Mamet play where my character was very quiet and like half my lines were no and I don't know. It was a 2-person play, by the way. But like I had to know exactly why I was saying I don't know or why I was saying no and that kind of thing. And I feel like you get that from all of the storytellers involved in this movie, not just the actors, but also the writer, obviously, and director.
I love the moment where Willem Dafoe needs validation about his cooking, like so badly. Me lobster. Yeah, exactly. But it is like that's an actionable motive in that moment, right? It's kind of what you're saying there, Bri.
Yeah, like they each have vulnerabilities and like you're saying, they have these histories and it gets hinted at really early on. I was rewatching part of the movie this morning and forgot how early on you see Robert Pattinson has that vision of all the logs in the ocean. And the first time you're like, what is this? This is super weird. And then the second time you're like, oh, right. And so, yeah, bearing all of that and making sure that's present. Also, the scene where they're just yelling "what" back and forth. Like, like every what's is like a specific what. Like I love that.
I love it.
It's really great. So my lesson is the importance of atmosphere. I think because it's a tricky thing to pin down, I tend to like things that can be dissected into clear parts and I can point to them and see like A plus B plus C equals this thing. For some reason, watching this movie and then listening to the talk that Robert Eggers gave made the importance of atmosphere click, and this idea of it's an accumulation of details. And I think hearing it described that way and also watching this film and feeling the result of that, this was maybe the first time that it felt truly undeniable that it needed to be shot on film. They needed to be on location. Like they needed all of these things, the set design, all of it needed to be the way it was. And all of that contributed to the experience in an undeniable way. So that's something that I'm going to be thinking about a lot moving forward, because it's clearly a very powerful tool once you can understand how to wield it. Maggie, thank you again for making me watch this movie, because I learned a lot.
Oh, of course.
And so, what about you? What's your lesson?
Jumping off of what you guys all said, I'm a sucker for movies that are light on plot. That's like I've seen so many movies in my lifetime, but yeah, those are always so fun to me, and especially as an actor, because you can only play character like that. That is your job. It's your job to be the character, to inhabit the character, and obviously you should know the story, but you can't know what comes late.
Right.
Like those are things that you can't. As an actor, like getting, seeing something like this, like, yeah, that's exactly it, because they don't, there's no plot that they need to play. They can purely just play these characters at this moment in person with each other. So yeah, and because there's light on plot, yeah, I mean, it highlights so many other things that filmmakers have to play with, from the costuming to, like how gritty is your window, to dialect, to, physicality, to cutaways. I loved all the times that, it was like jarring on purpose, cutting away from one of the characters. And he created so many emotional moments through all these, like film techniques that, ended up making a great story, even though, plot-wise, it's like,
minimal.
But also, these are the type of stories that actors can have so much fun with. And it's no surprise, at least to me, that William Dafoe was like, these are the kind of things that actors like, him would, love to do, because it's really fun.
How cool is it that Robert Eggers, people are just letting him make these very deep, obscure, historical, weird, slow-moving,
it's wonderful,
right?
Atmospheric things. More power to him. Like, I'm probably too scared to watch The Witch. Although maybe if I can handle this, I can handle it. But
guarantee you, it's not scary. Too much, much to my disappointment that October evening.
But I just love that we have somebody out there that's like, I'm gonna write indecipherable dialogue from the 1600s, and you're gonna like it, audience. I love it.
Although I do think it's funny that anytime someone says they based their language on other works of the time, books that someone had written and that kind of thing, I always just imagine someone 100 years from now saying like, I want to make a movie that sounds authentically early 2000s. So I grabbed Juno, The West Wing, and Moonrise Kingdom, and here we go. It's like you're basing your language off of fiction from the time, which is all you can do, obviously, but it's all, I always wonder, whenever the Oxford English Dictionary is like, here was the first time this word was used. I'm like, that's the first time that word was written down somewhere that you found.
Right.
So like it's probably existed for a long time.
Right.
Hearing him talk about the insane research process that did go into his version, like, reading primary sources and secondary sources and people that studied language, he would read their biographies, and just it sounds like there was a lot that was put in, but then also that had to be kind of, still converted to, kind of their own dialect for this movie, because you can't make it spot on, obviously.
Right.
Yeah.
And also I just wanted to mention the sound design also is just super great. And like you're saying, having this minimal plot lets you let all these other aspects of filmmaking and the creative process like do a lot of the heavy lifting, and sound is obviously great. That damn foghorn, it's just constant.
Oh yeah. I wrote a tweet, I think, today that was like, it has the Nolan foghorn, but it's an actual foghorn.
Right.
Amazing. It's insane. It's great. It should be there.
It sounds so modern, though, to my ear. I don't know. It's really cool where even though it might be a historically accurate foghorn, it has a weird creepy modern sound to it.
Yeah.
Great job, everybody.
It's like anytime a phone is ringing in a movie and someone won't pick it up because they're like arguing or whatever, you're like, just pick up the phone. Like the foghorn is that for an entire movie. Not so much that you feel like you want to turn it off, but enough that it's just always kind of like scratching at you.
Yeah.
Although I read that there's a scene where Robert Pattinson is painting with a paint roller, and that apparently wasn't invented until 1954. So actually, this movie is literally unwatchable.
We'll throw it out.
Why don't we go around and say what we've been watching recently? My random number generator has generated a number 3, which I've assigned to you, Trisha. What have you been watching recently?
Wow. Thank you. So during lockdown, now that it's been almost a year of that, I watched the entirety of the TV show Cheers, and which is only 260 episodes of TV or something like that. So it was actually less than one a day if you really think about it that way. But I finished all of Cheers, and it's a wonderful show, and I do recommend it. So recently, I finished Cheers like a month ago or so, and I was like, now what? I need something that is going to make me happy, but not, I don't know what next. And so I tried to watch Frasier, and I don't like it. I'm sorry to say.
Like Frasier. Interesting.
No.
I was a big Frasier fan.
It has the guy from Cheers in it.
Really, Brian? Really?
Yeah.
Really?
So now I made a hard switch. I made a choice, and I've embarked upon the journey. I've started watching MASH.
Nice.
Wow.
I am now watching MASH from the beginning. This is what we're doing now.
Oh, wow.
Have you seen it before?
Barely. Like, it was the same thing with Cheers, where it's like, maybe I saw an episode here and there, but no, I hadn't. We are back in the first season of MASH.
Wow.
And we are doing it. Alan Alda is being himself and being Hawkeye, and what an experience. Anyway, if you haven't watched MASH or Cheers and you're looking for something that's not going to bum you out even more, definitely recommend. The entirety of MASH is on Hulu. You're welcome.
Nice.
Amazing. MASH. Great. All right, cool. Random number generator says it's just going back and forth constantly. So, Brian, what have you been watching recently?
Speaking of Hulu, I'm a little late to the party, but I'm finally a member of the Pen 15 Club. Yeah, I am in love with it so much. I'm very sad that there are only a finite number of episodes. For anyone who doesn't know what it is, it's co-created by Maya Erskine and Anna Konkle, who are in their early 30s, but play 13-year-old sort of fictional versions of themselves in the early 2000s. And I was kind of turned off by that at first when I saw marketing for it. It's a Lonely Island production. So I was like, it's like Andy Samberg going to show up in braces as one of their cousins, and it's going to be all like crazy over the top comedy. And it's really not. Like, they do go to crazy over the top places, but they also go to these very real, relatable places, and it sort of finds this like really lovely balance between the two. They do such a good job of making you just believe that they're these 13-year-old characters, so you become invested in what they're dealing with. Maya especially is sort of the more volatile of the characters. She is crying and throwing a tantrum about something, and I just completely am with her. Like, I'm suddenly 13 years old, and I'm like, you are embarrassing her, Mom. And yeah, I just fell in love with the show really hard. Pen 15, can't wait for new episodes. Check it out.
Nice.
Awesome. Maggie, what have you been watching?
Yeah, I watched 2 movies recently that I really liked. Watermelon Man, which, have you guys ever seen that?
I know both those words.
Have.
Okay, I know both those words. Yeah, it's from 1970, so it's an old way. I think it's on the Criterion Channel. It was fantastic. I laughed throughout the whole thing. It was great. It was directed by Melvin Van Peebles, starring Godfrey Cambridge. Very over the top comedy inspired by Kafka's Metamorphosis.
Oh.
So, and it has a lot of
I'm into this.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's fantastic. It's about a white salesman who wakes up and is a black man, played by a black actor throughout all of it. But it's fantastic. And yeah, it's one of those that it feels like depressingly relevant. But it is so funny and a really great film. And the filmmaker is very talented. So I would recommend that. And then this would be a great double feature. Barb and Star go to Vista Del Mar.
Yeah.
They have very similar like energy levels from these movies, which is just great and just like a wonderful break, especially in quarantine where it's just
Yeah.
like I feel like I'm going bananas, and both of these movies are like absolutely right there with you. So yeah, I recommend both. They're both really good comedies.
Very
Awesome.
nice.
Yeah, I like that as a double feature too. That's a fun pitch.
Or Barb and Star and the Lighthouse, just like two
There you
people
go.
sort of going crazy together, you know?
Right.
True, very true.
What have you been watching, Michael?
So I randomly sat down one morning and turned on Disney Plus, and I turned on the Apple TV. Disney Plus was already there, and The Imagineering Story, which is a documentary series on the Imagineers, Disney Imagineers, was just sitting there. And we were like, all right, let's try it. And we turned it on, and we became obsessed, like hooked on this show, like in a way that I haven't been since like Dark for some reason.
Whoa.
Mm.
Which makes no
Whoa.
sense because it's just a documentary about the Imagineers over the years, but it's really well done. It's created by Leslie Iwerks. It's narrated by Angela Bassett. It's totally like Disney propaganda also, but it also
Like everything on Disney Plus.
Right.
Yeah.
But it does spend a lot of time going into what it's like to be an Imagineer and the different struggles that they faced over the different eras of time, and reveal how like a lot of the rides work, and kind of like for the first time go behind the scenes. And it's really fascinating to go on that journey, and it's just really well executed. Somehow every episode has a cliffhanger. It's
In
weird.
a docuseries?
Yeah, it's weird. It's usually because like somebody dies, someone important in the Disney like enterprise dies at the end, and then it's like, well, now what's going to happen now that Walt Disney isn't here? Like, what's going to happen to the Imagineers? Tune in next time. The Imagineering Story, available on Disney Plus. It's pretty fun.
Nice.
And I figured it couldn't be a coincidence that there were two people with the last name Iwerks, so I just looked up and confirmed that she is the granddaughter of Ub Iwerks, who designed like Mickey Mouse and like all these classic
Cool.
cartoons from way back. Yeah.
Makes sense. That the name sounded familiar, so that makes
Mhm.
sense. Awesome. This has been our conversation about The Lighthouse. Maggie, thank you so much for joining us. This
Yeah.
was so much fun.
Thank you so much for having me. This was fun, guys. What a fun movie to talk about.
Yes.
It's really conversation starter.
Yes, absolutely. That's a good way to describe it.
We owe you for bringing it to the table for sure.
Yes. So absolutely check out Maggie's YouTube channel, which is called Maggie May Fish. We'll have a link in the show notes. Yeah, it's great. It's fun. It's smart and it's entertaining. What more do you want? We want to say a big thank you, as always, to the patrons that make this show possible. Thank you to our producer, Vince Major, and our editor, Eric Schneider. I'm Michael Tucker. I've been joined today by Trisha Rand, Brian Bittner, and Maggie May Fish. All of our Twitter handles are in the show notes. Send us a tweet, say hi, let us know what you think about the Lighthouse. We love hearing from you. And we will see you in the next episode.
Bye, everybody.
Bye bye.
Bye.